Hey everybody, welcome back to the Bits of Good Bootcamp. I am Ben, Hypertext Markup Language Holmes, and in this video we're going to walk through an existing website to see how it's built. So at this point, all we've gone over are just the basics of HTML and all the tags you have available to you. So since we're not really in a good place to start coding right away, I just wanted to give some context to the tags that we've learned so far to see how they're actually used out in the wild. So I'm just going to go to a website that I built myself a couple months ago, actually. So shameless plug, Golden Swarm Games, an amazing club on campus for building board games. You should totally go check that out if you're a Georgia Tech student watching this. But we're just going to walk through how this guy actually got built. So it's a pretty simple website. It's a one-pager. So no other pages on this website. You just have a history section here with a timeline. We have just some cards that we can click between. We have this card layout right here with everything inside of rows. Here we actually have a calendar embedded, which I'll explain in a minute. And here we have some links for contacts and a footer down here. And then a navigation bar at the top that just jumps between the sections. So this doesn't really give you a whole lot of context just looking at it on the surface. So we need to dive into the individual tags that are actually being used inside of this HTML document. And for that, there's this nice tool inside of any browser that you use, Google Chrome in this case, that's called Inspect. So if you just right-click anywhere on the page and hit Inspect, you'll see this pop-up right here. And inside of this, it should look kind of familiar to you, where you just see this broken out structure of the HTML document that's being rendered. So we have our HTML tag at the top with the language declared, as you would expect. And then below that, we have our body section, which is just containing all of the content on the page. And then the head, which has some meta information, like the title, which is being displayed right up here, along with all the styles that are being used, which we won't dive into in this video. So inside of this, starting here, we have a very basic structure, a header, the main content of the page, and the footer. And this is something that you're almost always going to want to use when you're building a website with like modern HTML. There are a lot of older websites that don't really have this structure because it's only been just these past few years that HTML has been like this declarative where I can say this is a header, this is a section, a main, whatever else. But in this case, we're using the header just to display our nav bar and everything about our brand, in this case just a logo. Our main to contain basically everything on the page. And then the footer for this little piece of information at the bottom and a link to view the code. So I'm just going to jump into this header component to talk about how that's built. So first of all, we're going to see a div inside of here. And you normally just use div wrappers when you want to style something, but that specific box doesn't really have any meaning. Like in this case, this div, all it's doing is applying some padding on the left and right side of this. You can see that denoted in orange right here. And that's just for styling purposes. So there's no reason to call it like a section or something. You should just call it a div. And then next we have our image, of course, which just has the source of whatever image we're using. In this case, it's from an icons folder that's being served up. And then just some alt text that says what this actually should be called according to screen readers or tooltips when you hover over that image in order to see what it is. And then otherwise, we have our nav component. And a nav is almost always just going to be a collection of links that you can go to. In this case, we just have another div, a button that actually toggles this guy on and off for mobile views. In this case, we have a desktop view, so that button's hidden. But inside of here, as you'd expect, just a bunch of links that go to different sections on the page. And in this case, you see these little hashtags that are denoting this is the specific section of the page that I want to jump to. But of course, links are also used to go to completely different pages. Like here, another tip, if you inspect on an element that you actually want to look at, it'll just jump right to that area of the markup so you can check it out. And here we can see it's just jumping to the Georgia Tech website. So just a very basic link that's jumping to a completely different web page. That's all you're ever going to use links for, really, is just jumping to a completely new page on a website. So that's the basics of the header component. We can start diving into the main in order to see how this guy's built. So first of all, we have this massive stripe here. If we hover over our before, we can see this, just this entire blue area that's being covered by that. And again, that's for styling purposes, so it's still a div. Below that, we have our first section, which is basically our header section. And inside of this, we have our container of cards, also in a div, with a collection of images inside there. And then we have something called an H group, which it's arguable if this is the best use of an H group. But you'll basically use this whenever you have a collection of headers that are related to each other in some way. Like if you're reading a book, like a textbook where it says like chapter 2, and then below that you have a subheader that says module 2.1 or something like that. And they're directly above and below each other. In that case, you want those two headers to be related in some way. So you say that this is a group of headers, so an H group. In this case, it's being used in a slightly different context to group together all of the H1s here, where each part of the club name is broken out into its own header. This is fine, but the best use of this would probably be to just change the H group to an H1 itself, and then change each of these H1s to something called a span. And a span is basically a wrapper that you would use inside of the text of a paragraph or a header or something, so that you can apply styles to just that specific part of the text. In this case, it would make sense to put a span around each of these words so that we could sort of apply all this weird diagonal spacing to them. So a nitpick would be to change H group to an H1 and all these to spans here. But an H group is something that you'll use whenever you have like headers that are related in some way. So that's just the header section. We can keep walking through this. This is a really basic section here in that it just has a header and a paragraph. So you'll see that we're actually using an H2 here instead of another H1. And that's because you normally want to structure your website kind of like an outline you would write in high school, or a newspaper article or something like that, where if we're thinking of a newspaper article, you would have the main title of the article as an H1. And then for each of the subsections about that article, you would have those be H2s. And then subsections below that are H3s and H4s and so on. So they just describe the hierarchy of the website. In this case, these are subheaders for each of our sections. So it would make more sense to have this be an H2 and this main header of the website be an H1. And then below that, just basic paragraph, a link inside of that. And that's about it. So we can keep jumping through this. Our timeline, it's just a collection of divs for each of the sections. Slight note, you can actually have sections within sections if you want. So you could arguably have each of these divs be a section as well, because they're kind of a subsection of our timeline. But a div works fine in this context as well, because we've already declared that this is its own section. And then our div to wrap around a little checkbox there. And then something called an unordered list. And this is what you're going to use when you just have a list of items that aren't numbered in any particular way. Like there's no 1, 2, 3 structure. It's just a bunch of bullets. So you would use a UL for that. And then you can use an OL or an ordered list if you want to have those numbers. But you'll almost always be using a UL because, I don't know, you usually don't have those numbers displaying. And in this case, we have our H3 because it's a one level below our timeline. It's now an H3 tag. And then our LIs to denote each item inside of our list. So very basic setup. And then below this, we have our super fancy team section, which in this case has some buttons in order to change what content's displaying. The actual markup for it's not super interesting. We just have a really basic H2 for our section, a paragraph for this crazy backing text that you see going on here, and then a div to contain each of our images associated, and then inside of here, just a collection of paragraphs. So the one interesting part is including these buttons, and just to explain the use case between a link and a button, a link is what you want to use when you're going from one page to another or jumping from one section of the website to another. And a button is what you use when you want to change what's on the screen at a given time. Like a specific part of the website, you want to change something about it. In this case, we want to change the paragraphs that are displaying as well as the image. So a button is usually the best use case for this, where you just want to change certain information displaying right now, but not jumping to a new section. So that's just a use case for buttons. Keep that in mind when you're trying to figure that out. And the rest of the website is fairly straightforward. Like we have our section of cards, which is just a bunch of divs upon divs, and then our H2 at the top. This guy being an H3, of course, and this being a paragraph. So this is the third level deep of headers. And then we have our get involved section, which is just another unordered list, a header, and then this interesting thing called an embed, which we're not really going to get into in this course, but just to explain it briefly, inspecting that specific element. And it actually took me to a specific part of this calendar. But going to the top here, we see something called an iframe. And an iframe is it's basically a way to view another website inside of your website. So if you've ever used something called an embed, that's basically what iframes are for, where you're able to take an external website and just plop it onto your page inside of just this little window. So you may have used that for, say, code snippets. I know CodePen has embeds where you're able to see your code running inside of their own little box, or in this case, a Google Calendar. And you may have seen, like, when you're creating a calendar embed, it just gives you this little link to copy or the entire iframe to copy. And that just allows you to declare, this is where the website, this is the website that I want to pull from. In this case, I want to pull from TeamUp. And then some basic information about it. And then I want the entire container box to be 100%, 100%. And that's just some styling cues in order to make it fill up the container that it's inside of. So that's the basic use of an iframe. You'll rarely be using these, but you'll often see them when you want to embed something. You need to copy the code for that. And then at the bottom, we just have our footer component, the most basic one on the site, where you have a paragraph and a link. You'll often use a footer basically as like an index through your website for items that don't really fit into the main navigation that you want people to see. If you just have these sub-pages that are worth mentioning, like if it's a major company and they have a careers page that you can go to in order to view open positions, or account settings, or just other items that you would normally want to throw outside of your main navigation but still be reachable. That's commonly what you'd use a footer for. And in this case, a footer is just being used to link to the code base that was used to build this website. And just a little, smiley emoji and talking about how the site was built. So that's all I wanted to go over today. Just wanted to give some context to all of the tags that we've gone over in that little cheat sheet that I gave you guys. So in the next video, we're actually going to start diving into some code on CodePen. So join me for that. Be pretty exciting.